Okay, we're going to look at trap SAT problems. This is one example. This is a very interesting problem because there are a number of different ways of doing the problem, but the problem is actually very simple if you do it the simple way. You can get into all sorts of trouble going through book methods and everything if you don't look at how to simplify it. So they're testing reasoning skills. They also seem to be testing if you memorized a formula or know a formula from school. And the formula for the sum of the roots is negative b over a. Now it's also very similar to vertex formula, negative b over 2a, which is another trap. And there are so many traps in this interesting problem. It seems simple. The product of the roots is c over a. It's possible you might need that. It's less likely. We have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now this formula can be derived from the quadratic formula. It's very difficult to derive the quadratic formula itself, which you derive by completing the square. But you can derive the sum formula from the quadratic formula. And you could do it while you're taking the test. You could practice that ahead of time. It's probably worth doing that, actually. So we have negative b plus or minus the square root b squared. You really want to know this formula. They're possible. You can do quadratic equations by completing the square if you don't remember it. But they're likely to ask this on no calculator where you need to solve a quadratic equation. And some of them can also be done by factoring if you know how to factor. But they're going to do ones where you have irrational solutions where you can't use for factoring. So what we want to do here is we want to add the two solutions together. So we have a plus 1. It's actually, you can see the formula is negative b over a, if you're really good at math anyway. So you add these two together, and the negative ones drop out, and then you get negative 2b over 2a, which is negative b over a, and that's the formula. Okay, and that might help you also to memorize it or derive it. You should study the formula sheets. There are a number of different formula sheets available. You could Google formula sheets for the SAT or whatever. I strongly advise that you do that. If you didn't know how to do that, we'll go over how to solve this with the quadratic formula and also by completing the square. You may need in some other problems to really solve the quadratic equation. Now you're better off if we write this as m squared minus 8m plus 4 equals 0. You're factoring out the two. It's got the same solutions if we get rid of that, but it would actually be a different parabola if we just completely ignored the two. So then using the quadratic formula, I'll write that down again because aside from the fact that some students might not remember, understand what I'm doing, it is also really key that you know this formula. I mean, it's taught in Algebra 1, but, what can I say? I know everybody doesn't remember everything from Algebra 1. Okay, so what you want to do is we're going to plug in negative 8 for b, so we get positive 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 4 over 2. And then that's going to equal 8 plus or minus root 48 over 2. And then from there, you can see if you add them together, you're going to get 8. But you can, for some problems, you'd actually need to do this and find what the radical is. They may ask questions where you need to know what the square root thing is. So then this becomes 4 root 3 because I'm kind of going over a little fast, but that's 48 is 16 times 3, square root of 16 is 4. And you can factor with a factoring tree and all that sort of thing. It's a useful skill to be able to reduce those, but I'm not going to emphasize it too much in this video. And so then you get 4 plus or minus 2 root 3, and you add them together, you get 8. If you don't see to factor out the 2, it just gets a little more complicated with the numbers, and you can spend a lot of time worrying about reducing that radical or whatever. So we have 16 plus or minus the square root of 16 squared minus 4 times 2 times 8 over 2 times 2. Another trap also is you have to understand that the slash here goes over the whole thing, and then you can get in trouble. And this problem also, if you didn't do it that way. And then we get 16 plus or minus, this is root 192 to 56 minus 64 over 4. And again, I'm not going to go into how you simplify root 192. Totally here. Again, this is going to be no calculator, so you're not going to be able to use a calculator. It's going to be 64 times 3, so 16 plus or minus 8 root 3. Again, you could figure out that it's 8 without over 4. Now you have to divide the 4 by both of those if you're doing it properly. And you have 4 plus or minus 2 root 3. It's also a trap. It's somehow making a mistake. And you add those together, you get 8. Okay? Now we're going to go over another way of doing it, which is completing the square, which is useful. First of all, if you don't know the quadratic formula, also they're going to ask problems with circles that are actually solved by completing the square, where you find the equation, center and radius of a circle, find the radius properly, and you need to complete the square of both x and y, and they're likely to do that. So what we do is, with completing the squares, you would take half of the middle term here and square it. So half of negative 8 is negative 4, square we get 16. Now we had a 4 here, so we move the 4, we have to add the 16 to the other side, and we subtract the 4 from both sides, so we get 12 equals x minus 4 squared. This is a perfect square. Again, you'd be the half of that 8, and then we take the square root of both sides, and we get x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 12, which is 2 root 3. Square root of 4 is 2. And again, the radical stuff doesn't really matter. And we get 4 plus or minus 2 root 3. In some ways, this is a little cleaner than the quadratic formula. And then you add them together, you get 8. And you could recognize at some point as you were doing that the answer would be 8. Okay, so we have a very interesting problem with a lot of traps in it. A very simple solution if you know a formula, and some interesting techniques that can be used in other types of problems. Hi, this is my book, Advanced ACT Math. There are a lot of books that have 36 or 800 in their title. They're supposedly really advanced material, but they're not. This book goes into the hardest problems, makes them even more difficult, prepares you to get a top score on the exam, which is more difficult. It's very comprehensive, covers everything. Now, my website is here, and a lot of the material is available for free on the website. So please check it out first, and then see if you like it, you can buy the book.